Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 2, Research Methods, Part 2. And we're going to get into talking a little bit about the different types of psychological research. So let's start with kind of the two big areas here. We're going to get into talking about the experimental method and eventually the non-experimental method and kind of the pros and cons of all of this. So your experimental method is a situation where researchers control all the conditions and they directly manipulate certain conditions, particularly through an independent variable. So, what are the components of the research process? Uh, you're probably going to start off with something called a literature review or a lit review. And what this is a collection of a lot of different periodicals and previous research that for the most part is kind of in the same area that you are going to design your experiment around. And what it's going to tell us is what has already been found, what we kind of already know from previous experiments. From that, you're going to be able to define or develop your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is typically an if-then statement. If this happens, then this will occur, kind of things. Uh, Independent variables are going to be defined along with your dependent variables. There may also be some confounding or extraneous variables that eventually are going to kind of manifest themselves, and that might be part of what you would write up into the final part of the discussion, but those kind of things may happen. You're going to have certain controls that the experimenter places on the experiment to ensure that each subject has the exact same conditions. There's going to be some questions about sampling. Are you going to do a random assignment to group? What subjects of the sample are going to be involved? And you're going to probably spell out the equal likelihood of being chosen for this experimental group or for the control groups. Along with that, you're going to have some of your procedures that are going to be listed. The statistics and results are going to be there, and you may have to show formulas or how the data is going to be displayed. So you may be providing some type of charts or graphs to show this information. And then finally, that discussion. And as I mentioned a moment ago, maybe your confounding and extraneous variables show up there. You may also be trying to explain whether or not you were able to prove or disprove the hypothesis. So all of that's going to be within that experimental method. Most often, you're going to find this probably in a lab setting because it's just a lot easier to control certain things. But the truth is, there are some issues here with experimental methods that really are easier to handle when we do them in a non-experimental way. And that's why we have the non-experimental method. This is a way of collecting or doing research that occurs when we can't do experiments for ethical or practical reasons. An example of that is like cancer research. If we had to like just take a wide variety of people who would be in the population and sample them, we might actually be missing out on individuals who have specific forms of cancer that we really want to do the research on. So it would be a lot easier just to start with that group of patients and design our research around them. So we're going to go through some of the different types of non-experimental research that you could use. You could use what we call an ex post facto design, which really is a design that maybe cancer research kind of is based on. You choose subjects that have pre-existing conditions, and this is usually considered to be very ethical because you already have that group of individuals that you know have these conditions. And if it's a life or death situation, you can kind of design the experiment or the study around them. There may be some individuals that go into an experimental group and maybe receive a certain medication or procedure, and then there may be control groups as well. So, I mean, it still has a little experimental vibe to it, but may just deal with those people in the population that have those pre-existing conditions. Correlation studies. This typically determines a relationship between two variables. It's usually very statistical. You have a situation where you may say, the question hypothesis might be something of the fact that if a student is gaming, then their grades will be lower. And so or the amount of time a person games may impact lower grades. And what you're going to do is try to prove whether or not gaming has an impact on the level of somebody's grades. Okay. This is kind of a statistical kind of nature because we're looking at the strength of the relationship between these variables. Correlation doesn't necessarily always mean causation, and the degree of correlation is always expressed in a number known as the correlation coefficient, which for the most part summarizes the relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but a lot of times we look at like things like your ACT score and your GPA, and a lot of correlation studies out there. All right, we'll move on. Surveys. Surveys are kind of a quasi-experimental method in which questions are being asked to the subjects. There are some questions about like how you design the questions that are going to be asked to the people that are going to be, or the subjects that are going to take this. So when designing a survey, the researchers have to take great care to make sure that the questions are not skewed or biased towards a particular answer. And that may be a little harder than what some people just assume. Naturalistic observation. For the most part, the subject is going to be observed in their natural environment. So, you could talk about animal studies and kind of watching for that. But if you're looking at like educational research, observing children within a classroom setting, it may be maybe in a home environment, looking at child rearing practices. You could be talking about shopping habits of people who are consumers. All that could be within naturalistic observation. Longitudinal studies. Subjects are going to be followed or observed for an extended period of time. And this may mean that they're going to be kind of maybe interviewed. It could mean that they're surveyed. It could mean that they're examined. So you could use this, in a health setting. So individuals who were maybe people who had childhood cancers, you're going to follow them up in the years to come to see whether or not they have other health issues. It may be such a thing that we might be surveying people over a period of time to find out what their tastes are in certain consumer goods. But probably the most famous one is a study that happened in Europe, particularly Great Britain, known as the 7-Up series. And a group of subjects at the age of 7 were interviewed, and every 7 years since, they have been interviewed, kind of finding out a little bit about where their life has gone. And so we kind of followed them as 7-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 28-year-olds, and so on. And now some of our subjects are kind of entering into their 60s, and we're still following them to kind of find out what's happening in their lives. A cross-sectional study. This is a representation that is a cross-section of a population to be tested and surveyed all at one specific time. Unlike doing a longitudinal study, which can be really cumbersome as far as keeping track of your subjects, a cross-sectional study, we can get a variety of different age groups all at one time. So I could design a cross-sectional study to get a lot of input about maybe health-related issues. And we look at people who are, maybe senior citizens, to middle-aged people, to young adults, to teenagers and such. And I can do this in one setting, maybe in a course of a year, and be done with it. So it does have some positivities related to it because of the fact that it's not as time-consuming as a longitudinal study. and it's not as cumbersome because it's easier to keep track of your subjects. All right, the last part here, the cohort sequential study. This is a cross section of a population that is chosen, and then each cohort is followed for a short period of time. Sometimes this is done within the field of education, particularly with young adults who have graduated maybe from a college program to find out their levels of success. All right. Some overviews of research, and this is kind of a little review of some of the things that we just mentioned, but we mentioned the experiment. That's the manipulation of the independent variable under controlled conditions and the measurement of the effects on the dependent variable. Remember, independent variable, we're always manipulating. Dependent variable, we're always measuring against. The strength of this, it can establish that relationship, the effect of the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. The weaknesses, the ability to generalize to the real world behavior that can be limited. So it doesn't necessarily always relate back to what might be more practical uses within outside of the lab, so to speak. The quasi methods, which we were mentioning as kind of non-experimental methods, again, we're going to have the measurement of a dependent variable when a random assignment to the group is not possible. Strength of that can provide strong evidence that suggesting the cause and effect relationship, which is kind of cool. The weakness is you can't control everything. That lack of random assignment can really weaken the conclusions, and so that can be problematic, especially if you're going to go back and replicate the study. Naturalistic observation, which we mentioned a little bit ago, this is great when you want to observe people or animals in a real life situation. Strength, it can provide a lot of descriptive data, but a lot of that is a matter of how you go about collecting that. And then finally, the weakness of that, you lose those controls again, and that can be kind of hard when you talk about the replication. Survey and testing, you can get a large sample of a lot of different abilities and beliefs and behaviors at one time in one place. It's really easy to administer. It's really easy to score. You get a lot of statistical information that can be used for a variety of different ways, good or bad. Weakness of something like this, there we go, might distorted results because of the sampling error. So if we are, like if we were talking about testing scores and things like that, maybe we're not doing a very good job of sampling different racial groups, or kind of economic backgrounds perhaps, and that might lead to some questions about bias when we look at the overall scores. Case studies, which isn't something that we talked about, but might have mentioned back when we were looking at our intro class. But a case study is basically a in-depth investigation of behavior and mental processes associated with a specific person or a situation. So if I have an individual that I want to find out more about, I can go in and start looking at all the evidence or all the data that I have on them. And that could include testing, academic records, if there's health issues, maybe if there's been some issues within the legal system, all that can be providing a lot of information. So it does provide a lot of descriptive data. Downside of that is that some of the weird phenomena may not be really well represented. So let's talk a little bit about applied and basic research. These were a couple of terms that kind of showed up in chapter 1, but they do have a lot to do with research methods. When we talk about applied research, this is conducting research in order to solve practical problems, clear and practical applications. So really what this does in a nutshell is it seeks to answer a question in the real world. Okay, so it could be comparing maybe in a classroom different methods of teaching reading. Basic research explores the questions that are of interest to psychologists, but are not intended to have immediate real-world applications. So It's not always the most applicable, but sometimes it's kind of useful. An example would be, why is it that uh, students who qualify to go to college don't always show up? And that might not necessarily really bother a lot of folks, but it might provide some insight that maybe psychologists are really interested in. Thank you very much.